Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for attending today's webinar, Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. My name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and we are a full-service dissertation editing and consulting company. So we are here to provide assistance to doctoral students, much like yourselves, at any stage of the dissertation process. And when I say any stage, I really mean any stage. If you are having difficulty with topic development, we can help you with that all the way through to your final PowerPoint for your dissertation defense at the very end, and literally everything in between. So we have specialists for qualitative research, for quantitative research, for literature review, discussion chapters, and all of those. You can find us at statisticssolutions.com. We also have a whole lot of other good information, blog, a lot of information available to you on the website. I have Isades with me today. She is going to be running the show in the background in case of any technical difficulties or anything like that, but she will also be fielding any questions that come in during the webinar related to what we do here at Statistics Solutions. So if you do have those questions, you can pop them into the question and answer box. And as I said, during the webinar, she can get any of those questions answered. And then if there are content specific questions related to qualitative methods and the methods chapter that come in during the webinar, I will make sure to leave time at the end of the webinar to get those addressed for everyone. So you see our contact information here on this first slide, and you will see this again repeated throughout the webinar and then again at the end. And we do provide a complimentary consultation. So you can actually use the link to self-schedule your complimentary consultation for a time that's convenient for you. You could also email us or give us a call to get that scheduled. And that consultation is really a chance for us to get to know you and your research a little bit better, and the specific ways that we can help you meet your needs related to your dissertation. So again, my name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. This webinar is on mastering your qualitative methodology. This is an overview of the methods chapter. Okay, so most commonly you'll see that as the chapter 3 of the dissertation. For some of you, that might vary a little bit. So I try to refer to it as the methods chapter here, but if I slip and say chapter 3, please know that I am talking about the methods chapter. Okay, and so what we'll cover today is really looking at each section of what should be included in the chapter. So you get a good roadmap for what you should include. Okay, this slide presents an overview of those sections. So you'll start with an introduction, a research design, and your rationale for the design, because you want to justify all of the decisions that you make related to your research design. A section on the role of the researcher, and that is you and your role in your study. The methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and then a summary. And so I will say with one caveat, that you always want to defer to your school's template and or checklist. Okay, so this is really, these sections are sort of what I have compiled from working with graduate students over the years and what has been required of those graduate students to include in the methods chapter. So if you don't have a template or checklist from your school, you're not really sure what needs to be included, this should be very helpful to you. So it might be the case that some of these sections are maybe the headings are worded a little bit differently. Maybe you're not required to include all of these, but I promise that if you do include each of these sections, you will have a solid methods chapter to present to your chair and to your committee. So we'll touch on in this webinar what should go into each of these sections. And I should also say, you will receive a copy of this webinar tomorrow, I believe, and then also a copy of the slide deck. So if you miss anything or if you come in late, you'll have access to that. So your introduction chapter is the place where you want to remind the reader of the purpose of the study. Okay. I always think first and foremost about holding your reader's hand as you move through the dissertation. You don't want surprises. You want everything to feel logical and flow logically from one idea to the next. Okay. And so this is a good place to remind your reader, why are you conducting this study? Okay, so you can talk a little bit about the problem, maybe in a couple of sentences, and reintroduce the purpose of the study. But what you want to do is restate this verbatim. So everywhere in your dissertation that you state state the purpose of the study, it should be verbatim. Okay. You know that words matter. And so this isn't, unfortunately, the place to get sort of creative and flowery in your writing, because changing one word might actually change the meaning or some of the implications associated with the purpose of the study. So even if it feels redundant and sort of odd to state it exactly the same way, that's what you'll need to do. And then in the introduction, just like in introductions to other chapters, you want to preview each of the major sections that are coming up. So again, think of it as a roadmap that you're holding the reader's hand. And so this is the section where you're telling them what you're about to tell them in greater detail. So there will also be a section on the research design. Okay, and this is an important component of the chapter. Okay, so you don't want to kind of skimp here. In this section, you want to restate the research questions. So most likely you've introduced the research questions in your introduction chapter, in chapter 1, and those research questions will be aligned to your research problem and your research purpose. Okay, so restate the research questions. Remember, you're holding the reader's hand. So in case they've forgotten everything that they read in your first couple of chapters, if this were to stand alone, they would know what you are doing. Okay, so restate the research questions, and then you want to identify what it is that you're studying. So what phenomenon or case or concept that you're studying. You talk about that. Okay, and then you identify the sort of tradition. Okay, so if it's qualitative or quantitative, and in this case, we're going to assume qualitative because this is the qualitative webinar. We do also offer quantitative webinars. So definitely be sure to check out our website for that schedule, because those are available if you are doing a quantitative study. But you want to identify the qualitative tradition and then the design that you're using. So if you're using a case study, if you're conducting a phenomenological study, you want to describe that design. Now, part of this section that's really important is this is your chance to demonstrate, your familiarity with different research designs. And so what I see most commonly is that students are asked to identify and describe a couple of different qualitative designs that are possible options for addressing the purpose of the study and the research questions, but then you're really justifying or driving home why the specific design that you chose is the most appropriate. Okay, so you'll maybe talk about case studies and phenomenological studies and maybe ethnographic studies so that you show that you know what you're talking about, and you know what you're talking about enough to say, okay, but this is why a phenomenological study is the most appropriate choice for my study. Okay, so you're demonstrating familiarity overall with qualitative research designs, but then you're justifying why the specific design is the most appropriate based on your problem, your purpose, and your research questions. So that all has to be aligned. Okay. Now, why would you use a qualitative design? There are a lot of reasons, okay? Qualitative designs are really good for textual data, okay? So if you are planning to conduct interviews, if interviews are the method of data collection that make the most sense to address your problem, purpose, and research questions, then a qualitative design is probably a very good option. Okay. If you have words like perspectives or experiences in your purpose statement, in your research questions, that's a good key that a qualitative design might be the most appropriate. Okay, because if you think about it, a quantitative survey may not be the best for understanding in participants' own words their perspectives on something. Okay, what might make the most sense is to interview them about those perspectives, about those experiences. And so qualitative design would make the most sense. So data collection in qualitative research can happen in several ways, really. You can conduct interviews with participants or focus groups with multiple participants at a time, and they each, have a time and a place. And this is really highly dependent on your own study, sort of which you choose. You can collect documents and analyze those documents, do a document review and analysis. You might collect observations. Maybe you are conducting a study with a particular organization, and it might make sense to conduct some structured observations where you have a list of things that you are looking for specifically during that observation period. So a lot of different ways to collect textual data that might be appropriate for your study. Qualitative designs are helpful when the goal isn't necessarily to generalize your findings. Okay. In quantitative research, they talk a lot about sample size and generalizability and all of that. And that's not necessarily the case with qualitative designs. Same with hypothesis testing. We don't really talk about hypothesis testing in qualitative studies. Okay. We don't test hypotheses like we might in quantitative studies. And there's no real need to quantify the results as well. Okay, so think words, think text when you're thinking about a qualitative design and if that makes the most sense for your study. There are a lot of different qualitative designs that you might choose from. Okay, and this is something that, again, I get questions that are sort of, what's the best for my study, and it's like, well, I can't be the one necessarily to say that, but it all has to be justifiable based on your problem, purpose, and research questions. Okay, so those are established, and then you get to the research design. So this list is not exhaustive at all of the different types of qualitative research designs that are available to select from. But these are some that I see fairly commonly. So the first three are probably the most common that I see in the graduate students that I work with. And the last two are sort of less common, but I do see occasionally. So the case study, phenomenology, generic studies, those are pretty common. Grounded theory and ethnography are less so, just because they kind of are situated pretty squarely in particular disciplines. Okay, so I do want to talk about each of these though in turn and provide just sort of a higher level overview of what each of these designs entails and what it might be helpful for. So a case study is really good when you are looking at an example of something really in depth over time. So that case is that example. Okay. And you really want to drill down and understand it from lots of different angles to get an idea of what is happening. And so this might be an atypical case. It might be an exemplary case. It might be a counterpoint. It might present a new direction. So in that, I mean, it could be, let's say you are conducting a study of a new high school social studies curriculum. Okay. And you have noticed that across all of the schools that have implemented this curriculum, students are doing very well. Okay. They are apparently achieving at higher levels. But in one high school, or maybe even one classroom, student outcomes haven't changed at all. So that would present an atypical case, right? All of the other high schools are doing well, and this particular case is not. So a case study might be appropriate here to really understand what's going on. Okay, if they're implementing this new curriculum, just like all of the other high schools are, what's happening that is making it so that their students aren't achieving at higher levels? Okay. An exemplary case might be that all of the high schools are doing very well with this new curriculum. And so you look at one or maybe a couple, okay, so maybe it's a multiple case study to understand what it is that is making this curriculum so successful and making the students so successful. Okay, but the idea is that you're getting a really in-depth look. And so these cases are bound by some uniting factor. And so in this case, in this example, this would be that they've all implemented this new curriculum, right? So they're bound by this uniting factor. Case studies are conducted, data are collected through multiple methods in a case study. So in our example, we might use interviews, okay? We might conduct interviews with administrators. We might conduct interviews with teachers. Maybe you run a focus group with teachers who have implemented this curriculum. Maybe you conduct a document analysis of some of the lesson plans or assessments related to this curriculum. Perhaps you conduct classroom observations as well. And again, this idea, and this is really, this sort of triangulation piece, is you're looking at it from all different angles to really understand holistically what's happening here. And so it generates this rich description of the case and the themes that emerge from studying either the case, or if it's a multiple case study, then the multiple cases. I also see phenomenological studies pretty frequently. And phenomenology is really good for understanding what we call the lived experience. So the psychological sort of assessment of an experience, how participants make meaning of an experience. And so this is usually done through interviews, in-depth interviews, by which I mean it's not 15 minutes and you're done. It could be an hour and a half to 2 hours long. Really getting to the psychological meaning making of an experience. And so the idea in phenomenological studies, so this is, as you can see, heavily psychological, but it's also really rooted in philosophy. The idea is to examine the commonalities of the experience. Is there a structure to the experience that everyone who has been through this experience sort of talks about? So you're distilling these descriptions down to the structure or this essence of the phenomenon. And there are, even within phenomenological studies, like case studies as well, this is a higher level overview. So there are different types of phenomenological studies as well. So they all have kind of different implications. So know that even within these, you may need to be doing a little bit more research to get at just the right type of design for your study. Now, oftentimes what happens is that a case study isn't quite the right fit, nor is a phenomenological study. And so this is where generic qualitative design might be helpful. And generic has, I think, a negative connotation in terms of the word. And to the extent that I have heard from clients and webinar attendees in the past who say, you know, how do I justify this to my chair who just thinks it's not a rigorous design? And it is. A generic qualitative design is absolutely appropriate when your study doesn't fit squarely into another design, or when you need to pull from different elements of different designs. So a generic qualitative design is very helpful because it's flexible. You might conduct interviews with participants, but they might be more focused on the experience and not the psychological aspects of the experience. So the outer world content, okay, not inward. They can also include mixed methods studies as well. And so you may use interviews, you may use questionnaires, you might use surveys, either written or oral. You might use observations, but the idea here is that you can sort of pull from whichever data collection techniques make the most sense for your own study. And so I like the Percy and colleagues article that I have referenced here. You can certainly Google that article, but I think this is the most helpful for those of you who might need help justifying why a generic qualitative design is absolutely as rigorous as any other design. Because these are appropriate, okay? And a lot of times this design makes the most sense for a study. So as I said, you know, grounded theory and ethnography, I don't see quite as commonly, although I do come across them from time to time, certainly. Grounded theory is a very different type of design. It is qualitative, but it's also the most appropriate when we don't necessarily know a whole lot about a topic. And it's not generally for novice researchers. So if you don't have a whole lot of experience conducting research, this can be a little daunting because it can take quite a lot of time. And certainly for those of us who are trying to get through graduate school and pay as little money as possible, you know, the idea of a study that really takes this kind of time is maybe not so appealing. And I absolutely understand that. So the goal of grounded theory is that you generate theory from the perspectives of the participants, from your data. You don't come into the study, you don't begin with a conceptual or theoretical framework, because the idea is that you're generating theory. So this explanation of the process or action or interaction, whatever it is that you're studying, that is grounded in your data. So this is conducted through interviews, perhaps field work, text or document analysis, a lot of memoing, thinking, theoretical saturation, and it's a process where you are collecting and analyzing data simultaneously. So there's this real back and forth where you might interview a few people and you analyze your data, and from those findings you take those findings and say, okay, well, now I need to know a little bit more about this, so I have to recruit some participants who meet these new criteria, and then you interview them, and you do this until what we call theoretical saturation, or that point where you've really exhausted the entire topic, okay, with interviews. So you can see how this generates a lot of data and can take a long time. But again, the goal is to derive theory that is grounded in your data, that explains your data. Ethnography is another that I don't see too often, but certainly do sometimes. And this is really helpful when you want to understand a problem sort of within the larger sociocultural context. So it's really kind of situated in anthropology and sociology, those social sciences. It's a holistic inquiry, and we're looking at, networks of people, so social groups and institutions and all of those connections to understand how something works in the context of all of those connections. And so ethnography is unique in that it does make use of interviews, conversations with participants, but field work and participant observation are sort of the big data collection methods here. And this is another that takes a lot of time. And by a lot of time, I mean, historically, we're talking about 1 to 2 years worth of field work, and that's certainly not the case anymore. But that can maybe be, again, unappealing if you're just trying to get done with the dissertation. And ultimately, the product of ethnographic research is this in-depth account of the research problem, from the perspective of the participants in this cultural context. That's also called an ethnography. So they do have specific uses, but it all has to be aligned to your study's problem, purpose, and research question. So you will include a section on the role of the researcher as well. And this has to do with what you are accomplishing in your research. So are you an observer? Are you a participant? Are you conducting an ethnographic study and you are an observer and a participant observer? What is your role in the research? Okay. This is also the section where you will talk about any conflicts of interest that you might have related to your research, or power dynamics between you and your participants. Okay, so if we go back to, for example, the classroom setting, what if you're a principal and you're the one studying this new curriculum that's been implemented, and your study participants are teachers? That's a power dynamic difference. That's a potential conflict of interest because you are in a position of power over your participants. And if that's the case, it may get through IRB, right, your institutional review board, but you need to be clear how you would mitigate those potential problems. Okay, so that your teachers who are under you in your job don't feel like they're being coerced into participating in the study. You also want to identify any potential areas of bias that you might have and how you plan to mitigate these. So I am firmly of the opinion that we all bring some bias to our research. Okay, and we need to be transparent, open, upfront about what these potential biases are, and that we will mitigate them as best as possible. And so you need to talk about how you plan to mitigate those. Okay, and any other applicable ethical issues. So again, things like, do you work at the study site? Are you conducting research where you might uncover child labor or something like that? Any of that you might include in this section. You'll include a section in your methodology on your participants. So you want to talk about the population of the study. And in this case, I mean, what is the group of people from which the sample will be drawn? Okay, so the broad population here. And then your sampling strategy. So in qualitative studies, we're less concerned with random sampling, okay, because we want to make sure that, if you're conducting a phenomenological study, you need to make sure that all of your participants have been through that experience, right? So there are probably certain criteria that they will need to meet to be included. Okay, so purposive studies or purposeful studies, sampling, that means that you are selecting people based on certain criteria. Then you want to talk about what your inclusion and exclusion criteria are. So what are those characteristics that people must meet in order to be included in your study? How will you verify that? Okay. The exclusion criteria might be anything that it's not necessarily the opposite of inclusion criteria. So if someone met all of these inclusion criteria, is there anything else that would keep them from being included? Okay, those would be your exclusion criteria. You want to talk about your number of participants. If it's a case study, talk about the number of cases as well, identify those. And again, justify all of this, right, using in-text citations. So you'll want to pull all of this information by thoroughly reviewing literature related to your topic, and especially the methods that other researchers who have conducted research similar to yours have used in the past. Okay. Then you get into participant recruitment. And so what you want to do is talk and very in depth about how you will identify and contact and recruit your participants. Think of a recipe for this. Okay. It is really a step-by-step outlining how you plan to recruit participants. And I will say that the more detailed you can be in this section, the smoother your IRB application will go. The more information that you can put in now, you already have that out of the way, so you can just plug that into your IRB application once you get there. And you also want to talk about your sample size and how that relates to data saturation, or the point at which you are not learning anything new with subsequent interviews or focus groups. You will include a section on your instrumentation. And so study instruments are those things like interview protocols, observation sheets, and you want to describe each of those instruments, okay, and the source for each of those. So a lot of times in qualitative research, we create our own interview protocol. So we develop interview questions that are probably based somewhat on our literature review. So if that's the case, then you will describe how you developed that instrument. If you are using an instrument that is already published, then you want to describe that as well. And certainly make sure to include that you have permission to use that instrument. And so you do that for each instrument that you might be using. For document review, you want to identify those sources as well. And you want to describe how you will verify their accuracy. Okay, that's important too. So for each instrument, you want to demonstrate how those sources of data, so the data that you're collecting using each of those instruments, will address the research questions. For each instrument, then think about it like this. You want to describe where data will be collected, who will collect the data. Okay. And some of you might be laughing because, of course it's you, but other people get really lucky and have research assistants. And so if it's a research assistant, then you will say that a research assistant is collecting your data. You will identify the frequency and duration of data collection events. So are you going to interview participants one time and that's it? Will you be interviewing them 3 times? Will it be 3 times over the course of 6 weeks, or 3 times over the course of 6 months? Okay, how you plan to record your data, and any contingency plans in case of attrition. We know that loss to attrition is really common in any research. So ensuring that you do get the sample that the sample size that you are striving for. If people drop out, how will you handle that to make sure that you get more participants? You'll also describe any debriefing procedures that you might use to follow, sort of at the end of an interview, for example, and any follow-up procedures. So will you be checking back with your participants to have them review the transcripts of their interviews? Will you be presenting them with a summary of your key findings so that you can talk to them about how their experience, is similar to or different from your key findings? Okay, so any follow-up procedures, you'll want to be explicit in your description of those. Then you will talk about your data analysis plan. And so for each data type, and by this, I mean, if you're conducting interviews, if you're conducting observations, if you are analyzing documents, we've got 3 different types of data. So for each of those, you would want to talk to how those data are connected to your research. So how those data will address the research question, and how you will analyze these. So coding procedures for your data. And there's a lot of really good information out there in terms of how to code, best practices for coding in, for particular data analysis techniques, any software that you might use in analysis. Qualitative software is awesome. It's really helpful for helping organize and visualize findings. So if you plan to use any of that to assist with the analysis process, you would want to describe that here. And then your plan to handle any discrepant cases, or those cases that seem to vary from or disconfirm the overall findings, the overall patterns that you might be seeing in your research, in your data. Most likely, you will include a section on establishing trustworthiness. And the 4 tenets of trustworthiness are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And so those are, the way that this slide reads makes it look like, this is mutually exclusive, that through triangulation, you can establish credibility, but that triangulation might not necessarily be good for transferability or something like that. But that's actually not the case. So triangulation, you'll see really commonly used to establish credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. So my point is that it's not just good for the credibility aspect of trustworthiness, using rich description, using an audit trail so that someone can come along, follow after you, and understand what you did, the decisions that you made, why you made them. Okay, so how you plan to establish trustworthiness of your data and your findings. I mentioned IRB before, and again, the section on ethical procedures, the more detailed you can get in this section, the better set up you'll be to go into your IRB application. So this is where you describe any agreements to access your participants and data. So you'll likely have institutional review board at your school, but if you are working with, say, another organization, or if you are back to our classroom, our high school classroom example, those research sites might have their own review boards and ethical guidelines that you will need to follow. This is all to ensure ethical treatment of human participants. Okay, so any permissions that you need, you'll talk about them here. Ethical considerations related to recruitment and data collection. How will you ensure that you are not coercing possible participants to be in your study? Okay, how will you make sure that your data are safe and secure? How will you ensure confidentiality of your participants? And I throw anonymity versus confidentiality in here because we really don't use anonymity in qualitative research. This would be where you have no idea who your participants are. And the nature of qualitative research is such that this is usually impossible. So then the goal is confidentiality, where you ensure that you're maintaining their privacy of their data. So no one else knows who your participants are. Okay, so maybe you assign them a pseudonym and you keep their data under lock and key or in password protected, encrypted files. It's sort of that level of detail that you want to include in this section, how you will secure the data. And then most schools require that you maintain those data for a certain period of time, like 5 years usually, but it might be longer or shorter depending on your school. And so how you will maintain those data and then destroy them after that period of time. So in your summary chapter, then you really want to recap the main points or the main ideas. Okay, again, think about pulling the reader along. So your problem, your purpose, your research questions, your methods and methodology. Okay, all of it has to be aligned and justified. So it's not just that you're sort of, summarizing. I talked about this and this and this and this and this. It's, if the summary were to stand alone to highlight what was important about the chapter, if someone were to just read that, what would they need to know? Okay. So really recap those key points and then transition into the next chapter, of course. So some tips for writing the methods chapter, because it may be that you're here because you just need to know what sections go into this chapter, but it also might be here because you have some sort of deeper philosophical challenges with getting started and, just sort of like not really knowing what to do and spinning your wheels. And this chapter can be challenging. It can be daunting, but it's absolutely doable. Okay, I do want to say that it can feel overwhelming because you are asked to think about your research in a somewhat different way in this chapter. And that way is forward. You haven't done it yet. So where a lot of people get stuck is in the what if I plan for this and it doesn't go according to plan? What if I say I'm going to do this and then something happens? That's fine. Okay, don't let the what ifs make it impossible for you to get started. Start with your problem and your purpose and your research questions. Okay, and ask yourself, what data do I need to answer these? Who do I need to talk to find the answers? Your participants. What documents will give me the answers? What observations will give me the answers? So what you want to do is write this as a recipe. So you have two parts, your ingredients and your instructions. Okay, the methods are the ingredients. The methodology are your instructions. To make chocolate chip cookies, you need both, right? It's not enough to just have the ingredients, okay? Because we need to know what to do with those ingredients, right? And it's not enough to just have the methodology or the instructions because we still need the ingredients, okay? These change, they can change all the time. Okay, this is where you're doing your best to plan your study in the best case scenario if everything goes according to plan. And just be aware that it doesn't always, and that is completely okay. You will address how things changed or what was different from what you planned in your results chapter. You can address it, maybe you were on target to recruit 12 participants and you were only able to recruit 9. Maybe that's a bit of a limitation. Well, you talk about that in your discussion chapter, along with the other limitations of the study. Okay. Methods and methodology, they change. Okay. So you plan as best as possible, but it is not the end of the world if things change. So don't let yourself get hung up in that to the extent that it stops you from even starting. Now, if you are still having trouble, that's where we come in. Okay. Again, we are Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company, and we are here to help you, the doctoral student, get through this process in a timely manner. We provide support from start to finish with the dissertation. Again, we have specialists for qualitative research, quantitative research, specialists for the literature review. We have been through the process ourselves. So know when you sign on with us that you've got somebody in your corner who has been through it. You can learn from the mistakes that we've made in the process. That contact information is available here. Okay. And again, if you go to the website, statisticssolutions.com, you'll also see a button where you can self-schedule a consultation. So, if you're someone who's hesitant to pick up the phone, you can just click a button on the website. We have a ton of other free resources available on the website, a blog with almost every topic you could possibly think of related to the dissertation. So definitely check that out. But we do provide a complimentary consultation. And so you can schedule that. And the goal, again, is to get to know you and your study a little bit better, your own dissertation needs, and figure out really how we can help. Okay, so again, I'm Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and we're here to help. Okay, so I know some questions came in during the webinar. I will read each of these aloud so that everybody can sort of hear the questions and then the responses as well. And again, like I said, you will receive a recording of the webinar tomorrow and the slides as well. So I will just read these in the order that they come in. I have one on, okay, so the question is, when you are doing a qualitative study and you don't really have to worry about a precise sample size, you have to go back and find participants if people drop, or can you discuss this in your results discussion analysis? That's a really good question. I would always recommend trying to get the target number of participants. So I would attempt further recruitment 1 or 2 times if there is loss to attrition. I wouldn't just say, oh, well, you know, they dropped out, so I'm not going to worry about it. I would continue to try to recruit. If subsequent attempts are unsuccessful, then you would discuss it in the results or discussion or analysis section. Yeah, but I would always try to make sure that you get, you know, normally the sort of quote unquote precise sample size for qualitative would be a range. So you might say, I'm going to, you know, recruit 12 to 15 participants. But I would try to recruit the higher end. Yeah, that's a good question. I have another question about recommended software. So do I have recommended software for qualitative coding and analysis? So my short answer to this is yes, whatever your institution provides you for free or at a discount. Fundamentally, the software programs do the same thing. Okay, none of them are going to analyze for you, unfortunately. It's a really active process, and that's awesome. You get really in depth with your data. Different programs work a little bit differently, but they all do the same thing. The goal is to help organize the data, and they all do that. I work very heavily with NVivo, but I also work with MaxQDA. I have used Atlas TI in the past. I have used Deduce. Deduce is kind of cool. It's a newer one. I'm not necessarily making a plug for this, but it is a web-based program. And what's cool about it is that, you know, if you are sort of in the struggling graduate student, you know, finances are maybe rough kind of situation, they charge by the month, and they only charge you for the months that you use the software. So if you go a month without logging in, they don't charge you for that, which is pretty cool. But again, I would say always just check with your institution to see if there's a program that they provide for free or at a discount. And then of course, also, you know, I know some schools require the use of a particular software, and I would hope that if they require using particular software, they would make it available to students, but you know, you want to also pay attention to that. Question, how detailed is too detailed for each of these sections within the chapter? I don't know how to answer that. So they need to be detailed. As you're writing, be thinking about, if I were to be another researcher reading this work, if I were someone else, okay, what level of detail would I need to know to understand? Okay, so that's probably the best kind of guidance that I could give you. And like I said, some of these sections are going to directly apply to your IRB application as well. So I think a lot of detail is, in general, a good rule of thumb. The next question is, what happens if you can't get IRB from one institution, but you get it from another? Do you have to find another site, or do you have to revamp the application and or design? Yeah, different ways of handling this. This is one that, certainly you would want to talk to your chair about before trying to kind of make any decisions and totally go rogue. But I think that, it would probably be the case that if you're unable to secure approval from one institution or one research site, they would probably tell you what you would need to change in order to obtain approval. But it's sort of the retooling things until you can get approval. And if it's looking like you're not going to, then you may start looking elsewhere. I have another question on, let's see. I see that some articles say that they're using data from a larger project or a previous project. How do they do this if you're ensuring confidentiality by destroying data afterward, and or tell them that this data you're collecting is only for the project? Is that an ethical breach, or is it appropriate? So oftentimes what you will see is a lot of articles that come out of one larger project. So for example, you'll conduct your dissertation research, you write your dissertation, and you may be able to generate 3 or 4 different articles based on that one project. So it's not an ethical breach at all. I don't know from school to school. I mean, I know that when I was conducting my dissertation research, there was a special type of IRB application for data that were previously collected, but it all falls under the same research project. So it's the ethical issue. It's not about the articles that are coming out of the project. It's about the project itself, if that makes sense. And so it's the project that has that final, approval. How does a researcher protect participants' privacy during an online interview? You can do the best that you can on your end to ensure their privacy. Things like if you're conducting via like Zoom software, making sure that it is, a password is required to enter the interview, that kind of thing. From the participants' end, though, you're not going to be able to ultimately. It may be that they are able to, be in a quiet, private place for the interview, but they might be, sitting at their kitchen table and like their whole family is around them while you're doing the interview. So you just describe that, discuss it, recognizing that we can only, as researchers, do the best that we can on our end to ensure privacy. The next question is, do I have advice for a situation where your dean is in disagreement with your committee regarding your qualitative approach? Yeah, don't get caught in those crosshairs. That is an unfortunate situation. I'm sorry that you're dealing with that. This is something that I hear pretty frequently, saw a lot in my own graduate program, sort of the infighting and things like that. This is obviously not an issue with you. It's an issue with your committee and your dean, but you will have to find some happy medium because they are all going to have to sign off on your dissertation. So I would say in this case, don't be too married to your approach and be willing to be flexible, because you don't want to be doing this forever. You want to get on and live your best life post dissertation. The next question is, are there similarities between data triangulation method and the generic method? So data triangulation is not a design. It's a way to establish trustworthiness of the data. So triangulation would be if you are collecting data from multiple sources. Okay, so those might be interviews with different groups of people. It might be that you're conducting interviews and observations. So those would be two different types of data. The generic qualitative design is a design. The next question is, if I use a tool for my research project, do I need to necessarily use the same method and theory as the author of the tool? That's a great question. No, you don't. I think that it would be prudent to discuss the context in which that tool was used, and how it was developed and all of that. But no, you don't necessarily need to use those. And I think, the other thing that you would just want to do is talk about why, that's not the most appropriate for your study, and why using it for your study in your particular context is appropriate. Really, the goal is just to be detailed and transparent. I hate this phrase, at the end of the day, but at the end of the day, that's what you need out of every section, right? Is the transparency and the detail, so that someone comes along, reads it, and understands exactly what you've done and why you've done it. Okay. So we are at the end of our webinar. I want to thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon, or perhaps evening, or maybe even still morning where you're at. This is the methods webinar. We have so many other webinars available related to all chapters of the dissertation, quantitative methods. Definitely check out our website, statisticsolutions.com, for a whole lot of other tools and the webinar schedule. And then also make sure that you schedule your complimentary consultation so that we can get to know you better and figure out how we can best help you get through the dissertation process and on to the rest of your life. Thanks again. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.